Move along before I find a real reason to lock you up. Because kids like you don't just wander into this neighborhood to look at the trees. Officer Thomas Miller leaned down, his face inches from the open window of a beat-up sedan. The vehicle belonged to a teenager who had dared to park near the entrance of the gated Pinewood Estates subdivision. Miller's hand rested on the black leather grip of his service weapon, a physical projection of authority meant to intimidate. The young driver kept his eyes on his lap, knuckles white, on the steering wheel, his breathing shallow in the tense silence of the morning. With a dismissive flick of his wrist, Miller signaled the boy to move. On. He watched the car sputter away, satisfied that he had once again kept the boundary secure. Miller climbed back into his patrol car. The interior smelled of old vinyl, sweat, and cheap pine air freshener, a scent that had ingrained itself into his Placely uniform over 10 years on the force. He took a sip of lukewarm, stale, convenience store coffee, his jaw tight as he watched the quiet, orderly streets of his patrol sector. This was his territory, a wealthy enclave bordering the Braden wealthy enclave, northern perimeter of Fort Belvoir. To Miller, his work was not about arbitrary rules. It was about maintaining a cultural balance. His gut was his most trusted tool, a bone-deep certainty that he could spot an outsider within seconds of looking through his windshield. 10 minutes later, Miller spotted a pristine white Mercedes cruising down the main avenue. The driver, a middle-aged woman wearing expensive sunglasses, was doing 45 in a 30-mile-per-hour zone. Miller pulled out behind her, activated his lights briefly, and approached the vehicle. His posture was entirely different now. He removed his sunglasses, offered a warm, polite smile, and leaned toward the window, smelling her expensive lavender perfume. "Good morning, ma'am," Miller said, his voice soft and deferential. "Just a quick heads up, the speed limit drops to 35 right past the bend here. I want to make sure you have a safe weekend, okay?" The woman smiled, thanked him, and drove away without a citation. Miller returned to his cruiser, his internal monologue justifying the interaction. She belonged here. She was part of the structured, predictable community he was sworn to protect. But the county was changing. Fort Belvoir's expansion had brought new developments, new money, and new faces that did not match the traditional, long-standing demographic of the area. He felt a deep-seated, everyday anxiety about these changes, a need to guard the gates of his community against the shifting tide. Maya Vance sat on the edge of her bed, the morning light streaming through her window and catching the dust motes dancing in the air. On her desk lay her West Point acceptance letter, the heavy paper crisp and official. Beside it sat a silver military compass, its antique brass casing worn smooth at the hinge. She picked it up, feeling the cool weight of the metal in her palm. With her thumb, she traced the familiar, deeply etched engraving on the back. "True North is inside you." The compass had belonged to her father, General Arthur Vance. He had carried it through his first combat tour during the Gulf War, using it to navigate chaotic, featureless desert landscapes when his instruments failed. Growing up, Maya had listened to her father explain the meaning behind those 5 words. He had taught her how to hold her spine straight, to keep her shoulders back, and to trust her internal direction when the external world became chaotic and hostile. "They will look at you, Maya," he had told her, his voice steady as bedrock, "and they will want to know how you got to where you are. They will look for wrinkles in your uniform because they want to find a reason to doubt you. You keep your head high. You belong in every room you enter." The sweet, rich aroma of warm maple syrup and melted butter drifted up from the kitchen. Her grandmother, Martha, was cooking her famous birthday pancakes. Maya smiled, set the compass in her pocket, and went downstairs. Martha was waiting by the stove, a spatula in her hand and a rare, soft smile on her face. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a set of car keys, placing them in Maya's hand. "Happy 18th birthday, baby," Martha said, her voice thick with emotion. "Your father left something for you in the driveway before he headed to the base." Maya walked out onto the front porch, her bare feet pressing against the cool wood. Sitting in the driveway, reflecting the early morning sun, was a dark, forest green Aston Martin DBX. A giant red bow was fastened to the hood, and the red bow was fastened to the hood. Personalized license plate read Maya 04. Maya stared at the vehicle, her breath catching. It was a beautiful machine, a $220,000 piece of automotive art. But as she looked at the gleaming paint, the hand-stitched leather interior visible through the glass, she didn't feel excitement. Instead, she felt a sudden, heavy dread. She knew the luxury of the vehicle would be seen as a target. She knew the everyday prejudices of the world would not easily reconcile her identity with a machine of this caliber. She reached into her pocket, her fingers wrapping around the cold silver compass, drawing strength from the words engraved on its back. The Aston Martin's engine purred to life with a deep, low-frequency rumble that vibrated through the steering wheel and into Maya's chest. The interior smelled of expensive new leather and wool, a clean, structured environment that felt completely disconnected from the dusty streets of her childhood memories. She adjusted her mirrors, fastened her seatbelt, and pulled out of the driveway, keeping her hands positioned precisely at 10 and 2. Maya drove with meticulous care. She maintained the exact speed limit, signaled every turn well in advance, and stopped completely at every stop sign, her eyes focused on the road ahead. She was on her way to Fayetteville to meet her high school friends for a graduation lunch, her Taylor Swift playlist playing softly through the car's premium speakers. Officer Thomas Miller sat in his patrol car near the intersection of Route 1, his half-empty convenience store coffee cup resting in the holder, the engine ticking quietly as it idled. He was watching the traffic, his mind running through his routine mental calculations. Then, the dark forest green SUV caught his eye, his eyes narrowing as he registered the driver. A young black female. Braids, ripped jeans, a crop top, driving a brand new $220,000 Aston Martin. Miller's hand went automatically to his computer terminal. He ran the plate. Maya 04. The system responded within seconds. Registered owner, Arthur Vance. Address, Pinewood Estates. No warrants, no violations. Current registration, a completely spotless record. But Miller's ingrained bias immediately overrode the digital evidence. His brain refused to accept the data. A teenage black girl did not legitimately drive an 18 Aston Martin in this neighborhood. He told himself that the vehicle was likely taken without permission, or perhaps it was part of a structured luxury auto theft ring that used young drivers to move stolen property across county lines. His bone-deep prejudice, masquerading as professional experience, dictated his next move. He pulled out of the median, his tires chirping against the asphalt as he accelerated behind the dark green SUV. He followed her for 3 blocks, his eyes searching for any minor infraction, any lane drift, any sudden speed change. Maya drove flawlessly, but Miller had already made his decision. He reached for his light bar switch and flipped it. The sudden, violent flash of red and blue strobe lights reflected off the dark, green paint of the Aston Martin, filling the interior of the car and shattered the quiet of Maya's afternoon. Calvin Drake stood behind the counter of his small hardware store, his hands moving methodically as he arranged brass fittings into a metal bin. The quiet clink of metal against metal was the only sound in the shop, a familiar rhythm that had kept him grounded since his retirement from the military. Outside, the place cound. Heavy midday heat was rising off the asphalt of Route 1, shimmering in distorted waves across the parking lot. The air inside the store was thick with the rich, heavy scents of motor oil, copper wire, sawdust, and the dry paper smell of cardboard boxes. He looked through the large front window, past the dust-covered display of lawnmowers. A dark forest green Aston Martin DBX pulled into the shopping center parking lot, moving with deliberate, careful slowness, and came to a stop. A split second later, a county patrol car followed, its red and blue lights reflecting sharply against the polished green metal. Calvin's posture stiffened. He knew that car. He knew the license plate. Maya 04. He had helped General Arthur Vance pick out that custom plate just last month. He watched the patrol car door swing open. Officer Thomas Miller stepped out, his shoulders squared, his hand resting on his utility belt with an ingrained, practiced authority. Through the windshield of the Aston Martin, Calvin saw Maya Vance. Her hands were flat at 10, and 2 on the steering wheel, her knuckles white, her spine perfectly straight, just as her father had trained her. Miller walked to the driver's side, his leather boots squeaking against the hot, dry pavement. He tapped the glass with his heavy metal flashlight. A sharp, mocking sound. Roll the window down. Now. Maya pressed the button. The window glided down silently, releasing the cool, leather-scented air of the interior into the muggy heat of the parking lot. License and registration. Officer, Maya said, her voice quiet, steady, carrying the heavy weight of a quote. Rock. May I reach into my purse? It is on the passenger seat. Miller's jaw tightens, his eyes scanning the luxurious cabin, the high-end stitching, the graduation cap resting on the leather passenger seat. Slowly, keep your left hand where I can see it. She reached over, her movements deliberate, and retrieved her wallet. She handed him her driver's license and the registration. Miller studied the papers, his face flat. Arthur Vance. Who is Arthur Vance? He is my father, officer. He bought this car for me this morning. Miller lets out a short, cold laugh, his nostrils flaring as he looks down at her. Your father bought you a $200,000 Aston Martin? Sure. And I'm the King of England. Step out of the vehicle. Maya did not argue. She unclipped her seatbelt, the mechanical click sounding incredibly loud in the quiet of the car. She opened the door, her movement smooth and dignified. As she stepped onto the hot asphalt, the heat of the day hit her, a physical wall after the cool interior. Turn around. Put your hands on the hood. Maya complied. Before she placed her hands on the warm green metal, she slipped her hand into her pocket, pulls out the silver military compass, and set it gently on the roof of the SUV. The cool silver metal rested against the hot paint. Miller grabbed her wrists. The cold, mechanical snap of the steel handcuffs was sharp, cutting into her skin, forcing her arms behind her back. Around the parking lot, a crowd began to form. Customers from the grocery store and the dry cleaners stepped onto the sidewalk, their eyes locked on the scene. Calvin Drake watched from his doorway, his fists clenched, his breathing shallow. The crowd's reaction was an exercise in passive bias. 2 elderly women in sun hats whispered to each other, their faces pinched with disapproval. A girl like that driving a car like that, one muttered. You know how they get those. Drug, money, probably. A man in a golf shirt nodded in agreement, crossing his arms. People like her don't belong in Pinewood. The police are just doing their job, keeping the neighborhood safe. No one stepped forward. No one asked Miller why he was arresting an 18-year-old girl who had broken no law. The silence of the crowd was a structured, ingrained complicity, validating Miller's prejudice, building a wall of isolation around Maya. Miller felt the crowd's silent approval. It fed his confidence. He read her the Miranda warning, his voice loud, theatrical, designed to project authority to close the onlookers. You have the right to remain silent. Maya stood perfectly still. Her forehead was pressed against the warm glass of the driver's side window. She looked at the silver compass on the roof. True. North is inside you. She focused on her breathing, keeping her spine straight, refusing to give Miller the satisfaction of her fear. Inside the hardware store, Calvin Drake felt a bone-deep fury. His mind flashed. Back to his own service, his own years of uniform, the structured discipline had loved, and the deep-seated everyday prejudices he had faced when he took the uniform off. He knew the danger of intervening. He knew how quickly a black man can be targeted by a cop like Miller. But he looked at Maya. He looked at her father's compass on the roof. He looked at the crowd's active cowardice. He chose courage. Calvin walked to his desk behind the counter, picked up his landline phone, and dialed the direct, confidential number for the military police at the Fort Belvoir Gate. The phone rang twice, a sharp, mechanical buzz. Fort Belvoir Gate 3, Sergeant Davis. Sergeant, Calvin said, his voice low, steady, carrying the weight of his retired rank. This is retired Master Sergeant Calvin Drake. I'm at the shopping center on Route 1, just outside the perimeter. We have a situation. An officer has detained General Arthur Vance's daughter, Maya. She's in handcuffs on the side of the road. They're accusing her of stealing her own birthday present. The Mockstare on .com. Aston Martin. A heavy silence on the other end of the line. Then, Davis's voice, hard and sharp. Say again, Master Sergeant? The General's daughter? Yes, Sergeant. I have visual contact. She's cuffed. The civilian officer has. Her hands on the hood. He's calling a tow truck. You need to get MPs out here. Right now. Copy that, Master Sergeant. We are dispatching immediate response. Maintain visual. Do not intervene physically. Calvin hung up. He walked back to the front window. Outside, Miller was leaning against his cruiser, his radio keyed as he called for a flatbed tow truck to impound the Aston Martin. His posture was relaxed, arrogant, the posture of a man who believed his power was absolute. He had no idea that his bias had just set a massive, unstoppable military machine in motion. Inside the command center of Fort Liberty, the air was cool, smelling of industrial ozone, floor wax, and the faint, bitter scent of burnt coffee from a clash machine in the corner. The steady, low-frequency hum of server racks and cooling fans filled the room, a background noise that had been the background of General Arthur Vance's life for 32 years. He was wearing his standard combat camouflage, his eyes fixed on a wall-mounted display that showed tactical maps and supply chains. But everything changed when Colonel Robert Hayes, his chief of staff, entered the room, his face unusually pale. Sir, Gate 3 has a situation, Hayes said, his voice flat, trying to maintain military protocol, but failing to hide the strain. Fayetteville PD has Fayetteville PD. Detained your daughter, Maya, on Route 1. They've placed her in handcuffs. Gate security observed the stop and is maintaining visual contact. General Vance stood. He didn't slam his hands on the desk. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood up slowly, his tall, broad-shouldered frame blocking out the light from the desk lamp. His chest, marked by 4 silver-embroidered stars, rose and fell in a single, deep, controlled breath. Patch the Gate 3 live feed to my tablet, the general commanded, his voice cold, carrying the weight of 30 years of battlefield decisions. On the screen, he saw his 18-year-old daughter. Her braids fell over her shoulders, her chin was up, her spine perfectly straight. She was handcuffed, her hands secured behind her back, her wrists pressed against the hot forest green paint of her new Aston Martin DBX. Beside her stood a local officer, his Farron hand resting arrogantly on his utility belt as he called for a tow truck. Vance stared at the screen for 3 seconds, his jaw locking, his eyes turning to stone. He turned to Hayes. Have my driver bring my dress uniform to this office, Vance said quietly. The service uniform. full medals, full regalia, and prepare my staff car with a two-vehicle escort. I am going to collect my daughter." Hayes left without a word. When he returned, the general was already changing. He slid into the dark blue wool jacket, the material thick and heavy, designed for formal reviews and state events. He fastened the brass buttons, each one reflecting the fluorescent lights. Then came the medals. On his left chest, he aligned the rows of combat decorations. The Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military award for valor under fire, earned in Iraq. The Silver Star with an oak leaf cluster, representing 2 acts of extraordinary gallantry. 3 bronze stars, a Purple Heart, a row of campaign, ribbons from conflicts that had defined the last 3 decades of American history. On his shoulder boards, the 4 silver stars gleamed, representing the highest peacetime rank in the United States Army, a rank that commanded 50,000 active-duty troops. He took his officer's cap, placed it on his head, and looked in the mirror. He was no longer just a father. He was the commander of Fort Liberty. And he was preparing to protect his child with the full, undeniable weight of his office. In the parking lot of the shopping center on Route 1, the red and blue emergency lights of Officer Thomas Miller's cruiser continued to flash, casting a rhythmic, distracting glow over the growing crowd. Sergeant Sarah Jenkins, Miller's supervisor, had arrived minutes earlier. She stood near the driver's side door of the Aston Martin, her face tight, her eyes scanning the scene with deep-seated frustration. "Miller, what are you doing?" Jenkins hissed, her voice low so the crowd couldn't hear. "You have an 18-year-old girl in handcuffs on a public road. Where is your probable cause?" "Sarge, she's driving a $200,000 car, and it's registered to an Arthur Vance," Miller defended, his voice high-pitched, his jaw tight as he kept his hand near his holster. "I ran the plates. No stolen vehicle report, but the demographics don't match. It's suspicious. I was verifying. You handcuffed her first, and you're verifying second," Jenkins said, her fingers curling into tight fists. "That is profiling, Miller." "It's not. Procedure." Before Miller could respond, the low, powerful rumble of heavy V8 engines rolled across the parking lot. The crowd on the sidewalk turned, their phones still raised. 3 black Chevrolet Suburbans, their windows tinted dark, turned onto Route 1, moving in a precise, tight formation. The lead vehicle had flags mounted on both front fenders, 4 white stars on a front fender's red background, the personal flag of a 4-star general. The vehicles came to a stop, forming a semicircle that completely blocked the Fayetteville PD cruisers. 6 military police officers, armed and in full gear, stepped out of the first and third vehicles. They immediately established a quiet, disciplined perimeter, their presence making it clear that the civilian parking lot was no longer under Miller's control. Then, the rear door of the center Suburban opened. General Arthur Vance stepped out. The crowd fell completely silent. The murmurs, the whispers, the quiet chuckles from the onlookers died instantly. General Vance's silver stars gleamed in the hot afternoon sun. His ribbons, his combat badges, the gold stripe down his trousers, everything about his uniform screamed authority. He didn't look at Miller. He didn't look at Jenkins. He walked straight to his daughter, his boots crunching against the gravel and hot asphalt in a slow, rhythmic march. Maya looked up. The same shy smile from her childhood touched her lips, even as tears began to spill down her cheeks. "Hey, Dad," she whispered. General Vance reached his daughter. His face was absolutely controlled, but his eyes showed everything the quiet, protective instinct of a father. He gently took her hands, examining her wrists, where the handcuffs had left angry red marks on her skin. His voice was quiet, only for her. "Are you hurt?" "No, sir. I'm okay." "Did they mistreat you?" "No, sir. They did not believe the car was mine. I know, baby. It is going to be okay. I am here now. He looked at Master. Sergeant Hayes. Sergeant, take my daughter to the staff car. Colonel Hayes will stay with her. I need to speak with these officers. Yes, sir. Hayes escorted Maya to the staff car. Then, General Arthur Vance turned to face the officers. He did not approach them. He simply stood there in full dress, uniform, and he waited. Officer Thomas Miller had no choice. He walked over, every step feeling like walking to his execution. I am General Arthur Vance, the general said, his voice flat, carrying no anger, only an absolute, unbreakable power. You detained my daughter. I would like to know why. Miller's voice shook. Sir, there was concern about the vehicle. Registration? It was registered to an Arthur Vance. And the driver was my daughter driving a vehicle I purchased for her 18th birthday this morning, Vance said, his words precise, cutting through the silence of the parking lot. The registration is in my name because she is 18 and has only had her license for a short time. She has a valid license. She has current insurance. This was all verifiable with a single phone call. Why? Was that call not made? Sir, I was in the process of verifying. You were verifying after you placed her in handcuffs, Vance interrupted, his blank and so, eyes locking onto Miller's. You arrested first, and you investigated second. That is not police work, Officer Miller. That is profiling. You looked at a young black woman in an expensive car, and you decided she was a criminal, because in your mind, those two things do not belong together. Miller had no answer. He stared at his boots, his smirk gone, his authority completely dissolved. Sergeant Jenkins stepped forward, her voice carrying a deep, sincere regret. General Vance, on behalf of the Fayetteville Police Department, I sincerely apologize for this incident. Officer Miller's conduct is inexcusable. We will begin a full internal affairs investigation immediately. I do not want your apologies, Sergeant, General Vance said. Apologies are words. I want structural change. He pulled out his phone, his thumb tapping the screen as he looked at the two officers. I have already contacted Chief Thompson. I have 3 requirements. First, I want full-body camera footage from this stop delivered to my office by the end of the day. Second, I want a complete, independent investigation into Officer Miller's conduct and his entire traffic stop history. Third, I want this stop to become a mandatory case study in implicit bias training for every officer in your department. If an officer in a combat zone is required to verify a target before firing, surely a police officer on a civilian street can be required to verify a registration before handcuffing an 18-year-old girl. He looked at Miller one last time, his voice carrying the finality of a court-martial. You will be hearing from my attorney, Officer Miller. I hope you use your suspension to think about who you choose to see when you look through your windshield. He turned on his heel, walked to the staff car, and got in beside his daughter. The convoy pulled away, leaving a silent parking lot, a broken officer, and crowd of onlookers who had just watched the full, devastating power of quiet, unyielding principle. 6 months had passed. Calvin Drake stood on the concrete steps of his hardware store, his hands tucked into his heavy canvas apron. The air was cool now, carrying the dry, crisp scent of autumn leaves, the dampness of the morning dew, and the faint, sulphurous exhaust of passing commuter trucks on Route 1. He watched a dark forest green Aston Martin DBX roll slowly out of the Pinewood Estates subdivision. The vehicle didn't stand out as an object of suspicion anymore. The Fayetteville Police Department had changed. The Vance Accountability Act had transformed how the local department operated. The data on traffic stops was now transparent, published quarterly, and reviewed by an independent board. Officers were required to verify registrations and establish solid probable cause before ever initiating a detention. Through the windshield of the DBX, Calvin saw Maya. She had her hair pulled back, tight, her cadet cap resting on the passenger seat. On her dashboard, mounted securely on a small rubber cradle, was the silver military compass her father had given her. Its needle pointed steady north, completely undisturbed by the rumbles of the road or the shifts in the wind. She slowed down past the hardware store, offering Calvin a single quiet nod of recognition. It was a silent exchange between two people who understood the cost of standing up. Today, Thomas Miller sits in a tiny, drafty security booth at a cold storage warehouse on the outskirts of the county, his uniform a plain gray fabric with no badge on his chest and no weapon on his hip. The cramped booth smells of stale convenience store, coffee, and damp cardboard. The hum of a cheap space heater buzzing in his ears as he watches a monitor showing empty trucks entering the loading dock. He looks at his hands, his knuckles dry and cracked from the cold, and remembers the sharp, mechanical click of his handcuffs closing around an 18-year-old girl's wrists. He had destroyed his own career because his ingrained bias would not let him see past the color of her skin, and now he is haunted every night by the quiet, unyielding weight of her dignity. Maya Vance stands on the pristine parade grounds of the United States Military Academy at West Point, her gray cadet uniform pressed sharp, her brass buttons polished until they catch the pale northern sun. The wind blowing off the Hudson River is biting, carrying the scent of deep water and cold stone, but her spine is perfectly straight, and her shoulders are held back with an unshakable, bone-deep certainty. She reaches into her pocket and wraps her fingers around the cool, heavy metal of her father's silver compass, tracing the engraving with her thumb. She holds her head high, stepping forward into her own future, secure in the knowledge that her true north is not determined by the prejudices of the world, but by the strength she carries inside. Real power is never found in a badge, a uniform, or the superficial symbols of status we carry. It is found in the courage to choose reform over revenge and to protect those who cannot protect themselves. If this story hit you somewhere real, leave a like, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to our channel to join our growing community. Let's keep choosing light over darkness, one heartfelt story at a time.